Do you know who really holds the power? The state or the local government? At first glance, it seems like cities, counties, and municipalities enjoy autonomy. But the reality is very different. Imagine you plan something important for your city, and suddenly, the state shuts it down. This isn't just a hypothetical scenario. It's an ongoing struggle that states and local governments fight every single day. In today's video, we'll explore what powers do states truly hold, how free are local governments in practice, and what rules actually define their authority. Finally, we'll look at how this power struggle affects ordinary citizens like you. Let's explore the complete book summary together. The Enduring Struggle for Local Governance. An analysis of local government in the states by David R. Berman. David R. Berman's important book, Local Government in the States, Autonomy, Politics, and Policy, 2nd edition, helps us understand the complicated relationship between local governments, like cities and counties, and state governments in the United States. The book explains the laws, political situations, and overall ways these different levels of government interact. It also looks at how their conflicts started long ago and what new problems they face today. Point 1. A main idea in Berman's book is that local governments are always in a struggle with higher levels of government. He shows how local areas constantly try to get enough money and resources, fight against rules and interference from the state, and simply try to keep existing as their own independent governments. Point 1. The second version of the book, which came out in 2019, adds new discussions about very current and often debated topics. These include rules about marijuana use, arguments over minimum wages, the creation of sanctuary cities, which limit cooperation with federal immigration laws, and how ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft are controlled. These new examples highlight that the disagreements between state and local governments are still happening and are always changing in American politics. The basic problem in how local governments work in America is a tug-of-war between the state's overall power and the local desire to be self-governing. This conflict comes from a legal idea called Dillon's rule, which basically says that local governments are just creatures of the state. This means they only have the powers that the state specifically gives them. Even with this legal limitation, local communities constantly push for home rule, which means they want more control over their own affairs and decisions. Point 1. Berman points out that these fights between states and their local areas are very similar to the fights between states and the national, federal government. Just as states say they have states' rights to push back against what they see as too much federal power, local areas often cry home rule to protect themselves from state actions they feel are getting too involved in their local business. Point 7. This comparison shows that power struggles, claims of rights, and disagreements between different levels of government are not just at the federal-state level. They are deeply built into how the American political system is set up, with one level being above another. Understanding this local version of states' rights can help us see bigger patterns in how different parts of the government interact and resist each other. It's really important to understand this changing relationship, not just for professors and researchers who study how states and local areas work together, but also for the government workers who deal with these issues every day. How well government works and how good public services are for citizens depend directly on how these interactions play out. Point 1. Experts who have reviewed Berman's book praise its deep thinking, calling it rich, nuanced, well-written scholarship. They especially note how timely it is, given today's era of political polarization and high uncertainty about institutional power at all levels of intergovernmental relations. Point 1. This means that political disagreements, which we often hear about at the national or state level, also make it harder for local governments to be independent. When state lawmakers and local governments have very different political ideas, it seems to lead to more state interference and states taking over local decisions. This shows that the challenges to local independence are not just about laws or how government is set up, but are increasingly driven by a desire to force state-level political ideas onto local areas, which further puts at risk the viability and future of meaningful local government that Berman talks about. To truly understand how state and local governments relate in the United States, we need to look at the history and the legal ideas that have shaped their interactions. Two key ideas are Dillon's rule and the later movement for home rule. Dillon's rule is a very important legal principle that greatly limits what local governments can do. This rule says that local governments are not truly independent powers. Instead, they are like creatures of the state. This means they only have the powers that the state government clearly gives them, plus any powers that are absolutely necessary to carry out those given powers, and powers that are essential for their main purposes. Point 1. This strict view was first explained by Judge John F. Dillon. He said that state legislatures are like the source of life for local governments, stating that the state breathes into them the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it creates, so it may destroy. If it may destroy, it may abridge and control. Point 2. This legal interpretation means that it's generally assumed local governments don't have their own power unless the state specifically says they do. If a state doesn't clearly give a certain power to a local government, then anything the local government tries to do with that power is considered invalid. Point 8. The practical result of Dillon's rule is that local governments are always in a position where they need to ask the state for permission, even for everyday tasks. This makes them very dependent on the state and easily controlled or interfered with. Point 7. This legal situation creates a strange problem for local governments. While they legally depend on the state, they are also expected to act as independent units, which leads to a constant power struggle for their freedom to operate. Because Dillon's rule was so strict, the Home Rule movement started. This movement aimed to give local governments more freedom and control over their own affairs. Home Rule tries to give local governments broad powers to carry out their functions and a good degree of freedom from state interference. Point 7. People who support Home Rule believe it helps local officials solve local problems better. They think this approach leads to good public policy because it encourages local areas to try new things and take action, since the power is in the hands of those who know their local issues best and are most ready to deal with them. Point 7. While most states, at least 47 of them, have adopted some form of Home Rule, how well it actually works varies a lot. Some types of Home Rule, like the Imperio and Imperium, meaning government within a government, model, offer strong protection against state interference, clearly separating state and local matters. Other types, often called legislative models, give local governments powers similar to the state government unless the state specifically says they can't, which offers less protection. Point 8. Berman sees Home Rule as a very important, almost last-ditch effort to save local government, showing how crucial it is in the ongoing fight for local independence. Point 7. Even though Home Rule is widely used, its continued weakness is a big worry. The environment in which Home Rule operates is often full of state mandates, prohibitions, obstructions, and the threat of state takeover. Point 7. This problem is made worse because local officials have consistently seen states moving into policy areas where local governments used to have the final say. Point 7. This pattern shows that Home Rule, even though it's meant to give freedom, often isn't enough to fully protect local governments from states that are determined to interfere. It suggests that states are becoming more assertive, even in places with Home Rule, meaning that legal rules alone can't guarantee local freedom against the state's political will. This creates a continuous, difficult battle for local officials, making it very hard for them to plan for the long term and consistently carry out local policies. Berman's analysis also places the relationship between states and local governments within the larger picture of American federalism. He recognizes the wide and far-reaching contact between the layers of American government, federal, state, and local. Point 7. The book explores how the federal government's influence, along with historical and legal factors, greatly shapes the political environment where state-local relations happen. Point 2. One important way these different levels of government interact is through federal money. When the federal government cuts aid, both state and local governments often have to look for other ways to get money, which makes them compete more fiercely for financial resources. Point 7. Also, the idea of cooperative localism, where the federal government works directly with local governments, sometimes bypassing state authority, adds another layer of complexity to local independence. Despite this, the main legal view still emphasizes that local governments are basically powerless compared to the states. Point 10. A key part of this relationship is how money and political freedom are connected. When states have their own money problems, they often reduce the financial help they give to local areas and make local areas pay for more things themselves. Point 7. This practice, often called unfunded mandates, directly links state money problems to less financial independence and more political pressure for local governments. This means that when states have budget issues, they frequently shift financial burdens onto local areas, which then makes it harder for local governments to provide important services and make their own decisions. This shows that controlling money is a powerful way for states to control local governments politically, hurting local self-sufficiency and their ability to meet community needs. Another important, but often overlooked, factor affecting state-local relations is a cultural tendency in American society. The book points out a strong tradition in American culture which not only praises small local governments, but also has a strong bias against big cities. Point 2. This cultural feeling helps create the idea that large cities are naturally powerless, especially when compared to the greater freedom often enjoyed by wealthy suburban towns. Point 2. This suggests a deeper cultural reason influencing state-local relations, beyond just legal rules or money issues. The anti-big city bias can make it seem acceptable for states to interfere with larger, often more liberal, urban areas, especially when politics are very divided. This means the fight for local independence isn't just about how government is set up, but also deeply rooted in how society views and has historically preferred certain types of local government, like small, rural ones, over others, like large, urban ones. This bias can be used by state politicians to push their own agendas. Berman points out several major problems that constantly reduce the independence of local governments. He groups these into issues of authority, money, state takeovers, and changes in how local governments are structured. All these problems together show how uncertain the position of local government is in the American system. State takeovers of local governments are the most extreme way states interfere and directly threaten local independence. Berman carefully looks at these situations, which can involve the state taking direct control over local services, money, or even replacing local officials entirely. Point 1. Such actions severely damage the very idea of local self-governance. These takeovers often happen when local governments are in serious financial trouble or are seen as being poorly managed. They effectively stop local democratic processes and decision-making, raising basic questions about what local democracy and accountability really mean. State takeovers are not just a problem. They're the clearest example of Dillon's rule in action, showing how much power the state truly has. They clearly show how fragile local self-governance is when states decide to use their full legal authority. The book also explores the difficulties and challenges involved in changing the structure of local government bodies. This can include various issues, such as debates about whether to combine metropolitan areas into one large government or keep many smaller, separate governments, or broader changes in the number and types of local government units. Point 1. Efforts to restructure are often started to make things more efficient, deal with uneven economic growth, or adapt to changes in population. However, these efforts can often lead to arguments affecting local identity, how people are represented politically, and how power is shared. The discussion about restructuring shows how changes in government structure can either increase or decrease local independence. For example, combining governments might centralize power, possibly reducing the number of independent local units, while keeping many separate governments might lead to more fragmented but potentially more responsive local entities. This suggests that the very way local government is designed and organized is a continuous political battleground, with big consequences for how power is distributed and how well local needs can be met, directly linking back to the main idea of local independence. The second edition of Berman's book is much more relevant because it looks at current policy disagreements that clearly show the ongoing struggle between state and local governments. These examples highlight how states increasingly use preemption, meaning they pass laws that override local ones, to control local policymaking. This often reflects bigger political and ideological differences. The rules about marijuana use are a strong example of the complex interactions between different levels of government. As some local areas have moved towards making marijuana legal or less punishable, reflecting what local people want or a desire to try new policies, state legislatures have often responded by canceling these local rules or creating their own. Complete sets of rules. Point 1. This conflict often involves a reverse preemption situation, where local areas try to make stricter rules than the state, only to have their efforts overridden by state power. Point 13. The main tension here is between local communities wanting to make their own decisions and try out new policies, and the state wanting to keep things uniform or control a politically sensitive area. Point 11. Local efforts to raise minimum wages are another important area of conflict. Many cities have tried to set local minimum wages higher than state or federal levels, driven by worries about local economic conditions, the cost of living, or ideas of social fairness. Point 11. However, these local efforts have increasingly been stopped by states. States have passed laws that specifically prevent local governments from raising their own minimum wages. This trend is often influenced by businesses lobbying or by political groups who are against such rules. Point 11. The clear way Republican-controlled states have tried to stop progressive policies like minimum wage increases shows a strong political and ideological side to these preemption efforts. Point 12. The creation of sanctuary cities is a particularly heated example of state-local conflict stemming from legal and political battles over immigration policy. These cities adopt policies that limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. This often reflects local values, concerns about community safety, and the unique needs of their diverse populations. Point 1. In response, many states have passed anti-sanctuary laws. These laws force local governments to help with federal immigration enforcement and impose serious penalties on cities or officials who don't follow them. Point 9. This situation involves immigration localism, where state laws aim to override local sanctuary policies and essentially force local officials to act as federal immigration agents, directly challenging the idea of local policy independence. Point 15. The regulation of new industries, like ride-sharing companies, for example, Uber and Lyft, gives another current example of battles over preemption. Local governments often try to regulate these services to deal with concerns about public safety, protecting consumers, and fair competition within their areas. Point 1. However, states often override these local rules, usually because industry groups have lobbied them to create one set of rules for the whole state. This greatly limits local control over these services. Point 12. The fact that regulatory authority battles between state and local governments provide an opportunity for U.S. trade associations to engage in venue shifting by lobbying a state government to nullify local restrictions on their development. 12. Clearly shows how powerful industry groups can use state power to get around local attempts to regulate them. Across all these current issues, a clear pattern emerges. States are actively canceling out local policies. This isn't just about making laws clearer or making administration uniform. It's a deliberate political strategy. State preemption is a way for state-level political majorities or powerful business groups to force their will on local governments, especially those with different political views or policy goals. This directly weakens the idea of local self-determination and the ability to create local solutions for local problems, adding to Berman's main worry about the weakening of meaningful local government. While Berman's way of looking at things emphasizes the bottom-up struggle, focusing on how local officials try to get resources, fight off rules and interference, and survive as independent units. 1. These examples consistently show that the state has more power to override local efforts. This confirms the basic truth that local governments are creatures of the state, suggesting that the local fight for survival is often an unfair battle against a state that is legally and politically stronger. It implies that local autonomy is more of a hope than a constant reality, especially when local policies go against state interests. This also means that local freedom is often an aspiration rather than a consistent reality, especially when local policies clash with state interests. The authority problem refers to the many ways states limit local government's power to make decisions and carry out policies. This limitation comes directly from Dillon's rule, which gives states the power to decide what local governments can and cannot do. 1. Local officials often see states stepping into policy areas where local governments used to have the final say, which clearly reduces their power to make decisions. 7. This problem is especially bad when politics are very divided. because state legislatures often cancel out local policies that don't match the state's political ideas, as seen in current policy. Arguments. Money problems are a huge challenge to local independence. Local governments often find themselves at a disadvantage when competing with state governments for control over money. 7 Both state and local governments are always looking for new ways to get money, often because federal funding has been cut, and they need to balance their own budgets. 7 A particularly serious part of the money problem is that states are very likely to reduce financial help to local areas and make them pay for more things, especially when the state itself is having money troubles. This practice directly stops local governments from providing important services and being financially independent. 7 The book includes detailed lists in its appendices showing historical state and local revenues and state aid to local governments, which gives a long-term view of this ongoing money struggle. 1 This situation highlights the idea of an unfunded mandate, where states tell local governments they must do certain things or meet certain standards, but don't give them the money needed to do it. This isn't just a money burden. It's a subtle but powerful way for states to control local governments. It forces local governments to focus on what the state demands, possibly at the expense of services local citizens actually want, which directly limits their ability to make their own policies and respond to local needs. This greatly adds to Berman's worry about whether local government can continue to be truly effective. Furthermore, these current issues highlight a repeating pattern: local governments being closer to their citizens and more able to respond to immediate community needs, often act as testing grounds for new policies. However, this very innovation can, ironically, trigger state interference, especially if the new policies are seen as controversial, harmful to the economy, or politically different from what state legislatures want. So, local leadership and policy, while potentially good for citizens, can accidentally lead to less local independence as states assert their control. That Berman's thorough study ends with a serious look at the current situation and future possibilities for local government in the United States. His view is always bottom-up, meaning he focuses on the real experiences and smart actions of local officials as they deal with the complicated relationships between different levels of government. Berman's way of analyzing things is defined by its focus on the point of view of local officials. He carefully examines their goals and what they do as they try to get resources, fight off rules and interference, and survive as independent units. 1 This approach helps us understand the daily realities and the clever strategies local leaders use to manage the complex government environment and keep some level of self-control, even with the legal limits placed on them because they were created by the state. The book also considers how the goals and actions of local officials, along with the groups that represent them, relate to the basic ideas of local independence, highlighting the political fight for local influence on state policy. 2 A key observation in Berman's work is the difference between what local governments are legally allowed to do and their actual ability to use power. While he admits that legally, local areas are creatures of the state, Berman says that this legal definition just begins to tell the story. He points out that there are forces of localism and observes that most municipalities are far from powerless. 2 This shows a crucial difference between power that is legally recognized and power that is actually used. Even though they are formally under state control, local governments, through the combined efforts of local officials, organizations, and a deep-seated cultural belief in local control, often manage to have a lot of influence and keep practical independence. This suggests that the fight for local self-determination is not just a legal battle, but is deeply political and cultural, where informal power dynamics can sometimes lessen formal legal restrictions. Throughout his detailed analysis, Berman expresses considerable reason to be concerned about the viability and future of meaningful local government. 1 This deep worry comes from the combined effect of several things: constant state interference, states increasingly overriding local policies, severe money problems, and the basic legal weakness of local governments under Dillon's Rule. 7 He suggests that the environment for local home rule is increasingly full of state mandates, prohibitions, obstructions, and the threat of state takeover, leading to a bleak outlook where the prospect for home rule is not good. 7 Berman introduces the idea of forces of localism, which include local officials and their organizations, as an important counterbalance to state dominance. These forces help create a situation where state-local relations often look like those between the federal government and the states, marked by ongoing talks and disagreements. Point 2, he identifies a strong commitment to localism in the political and legal culture of the country, which he argues is the basis for a general, though often challenged, level of local independence. Point 2, the book also hints that active citizen involvement is essential for keeping local independence. It suggests that local areas should involve their citizenry in supporting their local government from state interventions into home rule territory. Point 7, this highlights how important public awareness and participation are in defending local self-governance. However, Berman also admits that local independence is not the same everywhere. He observes that wealthy suburban municipalities are much better off than central cities when it comes to having the power to do what they want to do. Point 2, this difference is made worse by a strong anti-big city bias in American culture, which can further weaken the power and influence of larger urban areas. Point 2, this suggests that the viability and future of meaningful local government is not equally shared among all local areas. Independence is not equally available, with richer suburbs often having more practical power because they have more money and possibly less state interference. In contrast, central cities face bigger challenges, which are often made worse by common cultural biases. This implies that the struggle for local independence is not just about how government is set up, but also reflects and increases existing social and economic inequalities, making the fight for independence, in many ways, a fight for fairness. Berman's analysis also draws attention to a serious consequence of local power decreasing, its effect on public freedom. The book mentions Frug, who argues that a strong local government is essential for public freedom, which he defines as people's ability to take part in the basic decisions that shape their lives. Point 2, this raises the discussion beyond just how efficient government is or where its boundaries are, to a fundamental question of democratic participation and self-governance. If the weakness of cities harms public freedom, then the weakening of local independence has serious implications for the overall health of American democracy, especially for how citizens participate and how lively democracy is at the most immediate level of government. David R. Berman's book, Local Government and the States, Autonomy, Politics, and Policy, 2nd edition, is a very important work for understanding the complicated and often difficult relationship between state and local governments in the United States. Point 1, the book clearly shows how old legal ideas, especially Dillon's rule, still have a strong impact on how things work today. Even though there have been ongoing efforts to create and expand home rule powers for local areas. Point 1, Berman's work clearly outlines the ongoing problems that local governments face in many areas. Their basic power, their struggle to get enough money, and the constant threat of states directly taking over or changing their structure. Point 1, through detailed examples that look at very current issues like marijuana laws, minimum wage debates, the creation of sanctuary cities, and the regulation of ride-sharing companies, Berman powerfully shows how states are increasingly using preemption, overriding local laws, to control local policymaking. These actions often show bigger patterns of political division and ideological differences between state and local levels of government. Point 1, the book highlights that local independence is much more than just an idea. It's absolutely necessary for local governments to truly respond to the specific needs and unique priorities of their communities. Point 7, when local power is weakened, as Berman explains, it indirectly threatens public freedom by limiting citizens' ability to meaningfully participate in decisions that directly affect their daily lives. Point 2, despite these big challenges, Berman's bottom-up view consistently points out the ongoing dedication and smart efforts of local officials and the broader forces of localism as they continuously advocate for and try to keep local self-determination. Point 2, Berman's final thoughts express a serious concern about the viability and future of meaningful local government, suggesting that the current trends of state interference and preemption pose a serious and growing threat to local self-governance. Point 1 review of the book notes that, while some may see them as alarmist, Berman's cautions that the prospect for home rule is not good are seemingly supported by regular developments in the arena of state and local relations. Point 7. This way of putting it suggests that Berman's worries are not just academic observations, but serve as a critical warning. Calling his views alarmist, instead of dismissing them, emphasizes the urgency and real-world importance of his findings. It implies that the book is not just describing things, but also subtly pushing for more attention and active steps to protect local independence, especially from citizens and local officials themselves. The book offers a thoughtful look at the past, present, and possibly the future of local home rule, making it an extremely valuable resource for anyone trying to understand the complex ways different levels of government interact and how federalism works. Point 1. The analysis in the book, covering historical roots and contemporary problems, and its focus on the past, present, and possibly the future of local home rule, shows that the relationship between state and local governments is not fixed, but is a dynamic and potentially repeating process. Point 1. Times when local areas have more independence might be followed by more state control, and vice versa, driven by changing political, economic, and social conditions. Berman's work provides a strong framework for understanding these ongoing changes, suggesting that this struggle is constant and requires continuous adaptation and smart action from both state and local players. That in the end, Berman's local government and the states is seen not just as a summary of what is already known, but as a foundational text that can guide future academic research and inform practical policy decisions. Its contribution to understanding how different levels of government interact and how federalism works is considered invaluable for those looking for a foundation for understanding the relationship. Point 7. The problems and tensions identified in the book are ongoing and require continued study and the development of new solutions, firmly establishing its expert-level contribution to the fields of political science and public administration.